Right. Thanks a lot, Dan, for your talk. Now we have 30 minutes for questions. So please use the raise hand function, and Hans Bernhard is the first. So please, Bernhard, go on with your question.
Yeah, Dan, it's always an honor and a pleasure to be mentioned by you. Even though the dialectics of your talk now make me be afraid that you locate me at the Nazi Heidegger side,
no.
Identifying yourself with the rabbi, that shall make for an interesting. I am a bit surprised to be lumped together with Lynn Ruther-Baker, who is a metaphysical socialist, and I've gone to great length arguing against that position. Also, you have me pinned down with one sentence I allegedly wrote somewhere that the we is primary, where the last time I checked, what I'm saying is the we might be primary, and this is up to empirical research. So I don't know whether mindedness, so mind is a unity of attitudes, right? Whether that unity is plural. And by the way, I have the plurality condition in my work, I explicitly stated, or whether it's singular. So these are forms of unity, but they are different. And the plural unity is not a collective singular unity. What I'm saying is that we need to answer your first question in virtue of what is it that an attitude is ours. Once we have the answer to this question, we can do empirical research and find out what's the primacy. So from my perspective, you're very much focused on the primacy issue. What comes first? My attitude, and I think I'm more like on Husserl's side on this, is to do the conceptual work. Let's find out what it is, and then look at the world, because philosophy alone is not going to tell us how it comes about. So, and then I think I have this, set up the structure of addressing the question. Is it just content? Is it content and mode? Or does it also involve the subject? Now, I'm excited and exhilarated to hear that you embrace the subject. Welcome to the very small club. However, then the question is, what is the subject? And that also answers your question concerning the self. I'm saying it's the intentional subject, the subject of intention. And I'm trying to find out what it is. What does it mean for an attitude to be mine? And this is where the analysis starts. And I'd like to engage in a discussion about this part of my research and not the misreading of this one sentence, where I end up with Nazi Heidegger.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. I mean, Bernhard, I was a bit unsure whether to include you or not. And then I thought it would also be wrong not to mention you at all. But I mean, given perhaps it would be better just to have left you out and just been focusing on Baker. Because again, I didn't want to say that you were defending the same view as hers. Okay, let's push that to the side. I guess one question that you bring up, I mean, when you say that the primacy question is important, but then you seem to suggest that the right way to answer the primacy question would really be to look at empirical science, but presumably that's only one way to address the primacy question, namely the developmental primacy, because why not talk about ontological primacy or conceptual primacy? So I presume that there's actually a lot of different primacy questions we need to address. And of course, I would also agree with you that when it comes to the developmental primacy question, I mean, that's certainly not an issue that the philosophers can just address on their own. I would, however, perhaps also a little bit arrogantly say that I'm not sure that the developmental psychologists can address it all on their own, since some of their considerations often draw on philosophical work that might be in need of further philosophical clarification. So I think that the right way to proceed would, of course, be by collaborating. I mean, not just between philosophers, but also among different disciplinary perspectives. And I think, I mean, you know, perhaps this should just be the final remark. You know what? I mean, I think I will give you a promise now. I will never ever again refer to that specific quote from your work. Okay, so you won't have to bother with it anymore. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Bill Wrinch is the next. Let me remind you that the raise hand function is on the participant windows, which you can find at the bottom end of your screen. Okay, so Bill, please.
Yeah, Alessandro, can you let me put myself on video? You seem to have
disabled. Oh,
yes,
sorry, yes, I'll do that now. Let me ask you start video. Can you? Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so it was very nice, sort of clear, sort of setting out of sort of lots of distinctions between different ways we might think of the I, and different positions we might have about the sort of the relative priority of the I and the we. Dan, I wonder if you could put up the slide where you said, okay, here are these three options.
Okay, sure.
You know.
Yeah.
Okay.
This one, can you see it now?
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, I just wondered whether there might be room for a fourth option, sort of reflecting a distinction we might want to make. So you talked about different ways we might understand the I, but you didn't talk so much, I think, about different ways we might understand the we. So here's what struck me as a fourth option, yeah? So yeah, I very much liked sort of what you said about number one and why it wouldn't work, where you said, okay, so to have a sort of we experience, it's got to be experienced from the inside as plural. But to experience it from the inside as plural suggests we've already got an I and a you. And I thought, okay, that certainly seems like one way in which we might be thinking about the we. But it also seems as though you might think there's another way you think about the we as something where I don't, or you might think there's a kind of experience where I don't really differentiate, where the question of whose experience it is doesn't really come up. And then you might think that, well, a further position or a way of making sense of the first position that you don't like that might be a bit more coherent is just, you know, maybe there's something that's prior to all of the I and the you and the we. And that's this kind of undifferentiated thing. And if somebody did hold that kind of view, you know, I wouldn't feel that, you know, they were defrauding me by saying this is a kind of position on which the we is prior to the I. But it doesn't look quite the same as your number one option. And it doesn't look as though it's going to be subject to the same kind of objection as the number one option. Now, it might not, there might be other arguments against it, but I just wonder sort of what you'd have to say about that.
Yeah. Listen, let me just switch over because I keep staring towards the corner where you are. I think it's better to see you.
Okay.
So no, I think you are right. And I guess part of the point I also wanted to make was that, and this is actually, I mean, it mirrors a somewhat different argument I've been making over the years, where some people have said, you know, in order to really address the problem of intersubjectivity appropriately, we need somehow to posit a level of kind of undifferentiated anonymity prior to the distinction between self and other. And vis-a-vis that position, I have said, you know, if you go for that undifferentiatedness, I mean, you are not really providing a solution to the problem of how to understand intersubjectivity. You're basically just eradicating the phenomenon. And I think I would say something, and I think the point I would want to make, I mean, even if one did not, even if one did not agree with my claim that it's not really intelligible how something like self-experience could actually emerge out of that anonymous porridge. At least they should have the courage of realizing that what they are talking about at that fundamental level really doesn't deserve the name intersubjectivity. Mm-hmm. And I think I would say somewhat similarly vis-a-vis your proposal. I agree that it's a different, I mean, there's a difference between saying the we precedes the I and the you and saying there is some kind of undifferentiatedness that precedes I, you, but that undifferentiatedness just doesn't deserve to be called a we. And I mean, for a lot of, I think, conceptual reasons. And then I think the problem would be still to understand how are we supposed to move from that to this crystallization of individual perspectives, and I just have to say I just don't understand it. Now that of course is not to say, and let me I think that should probably be the last comment. Of course, I'm not saying at all that from the very start we are all experiencing our own perspectives as our own, and you know, being able to, you know, recognize the distinction between these perspectives and the ones others have. I think this is a much later developmental achievement. My point, however, would be that our consciousness is characterized by a certain perspectivalness and a certain individuation and a certain first personal character prior to us being able to label that, prior to us being able to label it as having all those properties. So of course, I think one can easily tell a story, and I think an intelligible story, about how our ability to describe and articulate and label our experiences as being my own, to a very large extent, is something that comes about as a result of social interaction and language acquisition. I don't have a problem with that story at all, but I just don't think that is not what, I mean, on my account, this is not what provides consciousness with its kind of basic individuation. It doesn't provide it with this metaphysical, you know, structure. I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so Brian, you're the next.
Great, can you hear me? Yeah. So Dan, thank you for this talk. I thought it was very reasonable, sort of the whole discussion and the claims you were making. And my question actually started to be addressed a bit in what you were saying to Bernard, but I kind of wonder if you have something more specific to say. I wonder about empirical evidence, like what sort of empirical evidence, perhaps having to do with development, perhaps having to do with the investigation of, you know, primitive social attitudes or mental states. What kind of stuff like this could bear on the question? I think I heard you say, and so this already partly answers it, that it isn't to be decided entirely a priori. And I'm suspicious of some of the claims about the primacy of the we as you are, but I do increasingly kind of wonder whether we should be open to some experimental designs that could provide evidence for the constitutiveness of the we. And I wonder if you think that if you are a theorist that's advocating the primacy of the plural, whether this kind of empirical route is the best way to go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I think it would be the wrong attitude to just rule out the possibility of any empirical evidence ever kind of counteracting your position. So of course, I think we have to continue to do experiments in all the ways people are already doing it. Now, I don't really, I mean, the kind of empirical evidence I'm familiar with, I think don't really support the we first proposal. And I mean, there might be developmental psychologists present now who will, you know, object to what I'm saying, but I mean, one story that actually was very influential to my own kind of maturation is one that can be found in this work by Daniel Stern that I briefly referred to in my slide. So he's a developmental psychologist. He's dead now, but he wrote this book, I think in '85, called Interpersonal World of the Infant, where he's basically criticizing psychoanalytic reasoning concerning early infancy, because there was for a long time a view among psychoanalysts that the first 9 months of the first 9 months of the first 9 months were somehow spent in a form of a dualism or kind of a symbiotic state, and that the child only started to obtain some kind of individual experiential perspective at a very late stage. And what Stern was doing in that book was to point to a lot of empirical evidence suggesting that from very early on, there are kind of, proto-communication going on, and there's discrimination undertaken by the infant between itself and the environment that seems to suggest that the infant has a certain, has discriminatory capacities to discriminate between self and no self from very early on. So I think all of that seems to, support my story. And perhaps one question to raise would also be, what kind of evidence could we imagine that would support, or that would, so what kind of evidence would count in favor of the presence of some kind of we perspective? And I think if you go to social psychology, I think the standard view would be that something like in-group biases, that's a fairly robust finding, but that only occurs much later, 3 to 4 years of age, whereas again, this capacity to recognize again one's own borders or contours and be able to discriminate between self and environment seems to again be much earlier. So I don't really know. Again, I'm all open. Let's see what evidence would people might come up with. But again, I would also say, and this just rehearses what I said vis-a-vis to Bernhard. We also need to be very clear about what notions of self are being employed, what notions of we are being employed, also by the developmentalists, because often, regrettably, they don't spend as much time making discriminations as philosophers do, and sometimes it's a little bit of a mess, to put it bluntly.
Okay, so Abby, it's your turn.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk, and I think this is just a kind of clarificatory question. So at a certain point, you were describing a kind of radical position regarding kind of phenomenal consciousness being socially constructed. And I had thought that you were defending that view, but I take it that you have certainly rejecting it. And I guess I was wondering, do you think that at a certain point, we have a kind of phenomenal consciousness, and that once we acquire certain kinds of linguistic capacities, is it that we can, is it merely that we are much more articulate about our being able to describe this phenomenal consciousness? Or do you think that, is there a kind of permeability so that the linguistic consciousness can actually inflect and somehow change the quality of that phenomenal consciousness? So.
Yeah. No, I would actually definitely go for the latter view. I think it would be a much too simplistic idea to assume that everything is, so to speak, ready-made prior to language, and language just carves out a pre-existing categories. And I think it's very easy to demonstrate as well. Just think about something like an emotion like nostalgia. or what about nationalistic fervor? I mean, it seems very hard to imagine that emotions like those could persist independently of language. So I do think that language in all kinds of ways restructures and also enriches our experiential life in all kinds of ways. But as you rightly, reasoned, I'm very skeptical against the kind of social constructivist take, and I guess the reason why I spent some time on it was simply because it's important for me to make it clear that, at least on my view, if you really want to defend the position, the strong position concerning the primacy of the we, then you have to go all the way. And it's not enough simply to say, well, we define, personhood, for instance, in terms of values and norms that we are committed to, because if that's the notion you are operating with, I think it's almost trivially true that of course, to a large extent depends upon the community that we are part of. So the reason why I was kind of arguing in the way I wanted was just to make it clear, well, what is it? What is the position that I think has to be, what is the bullet that has to be bitten if you really want to go down that route? And I didn't really spend much time criticizing it. Perhaps, I don't know whether you thought it was a ridiculous position and not in need of any argument, but I think on my own account, that way of reasoning, the only way, as I think I also mentioned, I think the only way I can kind of make sense out of it is if it somehow presupposes a certain higher order representationalist view on consciousness. So the claim would be, initially they are mental states, they are non-conscious, and it's somehow by them being taken as objects or targets by higher order mental states that they acquire their phenomenal character. I have a big problem understanding exactly how that is supposed to work, and I think higher order representationalism is not as popular today as it was 25 years ago, but I think it has to be some kind of socially mediated version of that theory that some of these people might be willing to endorse. And I think there are kind of independent arguments to be directed at that, but then I made this argument about the plurality condition being one that I think they would fail to adhere to in any case, and so there might be an easier way to kind of get rid of that option.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so Anna, it's now your turn. May I perhaps suggest you somehow shorten the question and the answers? So thank you.
Okay, hey, I just speaks faster. Hi, Dan. That was really a great talk, and you made me think, and I have two questions for you. The first question is, why is it so important to ask about what is coming first? Couldn't we think about the theory it's coming together? And the second question is, are you playing with a trick card? If you're arguing for the claim number 3, you make use of the trick that namely, that there's something like pre-reflective self-consciousness, and then you can do the whole work, this is primary. But what would you object to people who are saying, oh, maybe there's pre-reflective we consciousness as well, and that could do the same game? And then you have to argue why your way is better.
Yeah, well, I guess you are kind of taking Hans Bernhard's view now, because that's what he has been arguing. Yeah, but well, okay, sorry, because just one. So just to make it clear, I actually do think that there is something like pre-reflective we consciousness.
Okay.
I think it would be a big mistake to assume that we consciousness only occurs when we are kind of reflectively scrutinizing what is going on between us. And I think, a very easy example of that might be, and I apologize for those who have heard that example mentioned before. Imagine that the two of us, since we know each other, we are going to the cinema together, we are enjoying a movie together. I think being together and watching it together influences also the way we are effectively responding to the movie. Then we go out of the cinema, we encounter a common friend. The common friend asks us, well, what have you been doing? And I might then say, well, we just went to the cinema and we were enjoying ourselves. I don't think that the we consciousness only comes about at that moment. I think it were there already previously. So I think there is something like pre-reflective we consciousness. But of course, the question is, the relevant question, I think, in this context is whether it precedes individual pre-reflective self-consciousness. And I mean, that's the option that I don't see any empirical evidence suggesting that, and I have a conceptual problem understanding how that is supposed to work. So I think that would be for the latter. And the first question, sorry, what was the
first one? Is why it's not coming together. Why one must be first?
Yeah, well, okay, but I think and I mean, I can see the attraction of that. I mean, it seems like an ecumenical solution. I mean, why not just accept that all is there from the very start? But I think my reason for denying that is that I think that the we is a very specific social formation. I don't think one should equate the we with just any form of sociality whatsoever. And I think that in order for that to be possible, I think it requires very specific relationships kind of building between us. And I just don't think that is there from the very start. So I can easily imagine interaction going on between the infant and another infant, or the infant and the caretaker, that is social in character, but where it is not yet appropriate to label that a form of we. And so, I mean, arguing that there's always a we whenever there is a self-experience and whenever there is some kind of other experience, again, I mean, that's, I think, empirically, I think, fairly implausible.
Okay, so we experience is much more complicated than what I think.
Well, I'm not sure that they're necessarily more complicated, but I just think there are certain preconditions that have to be in place. Mm-hmm. Perhaps they're complicated in that sense, but I just don't think just the two of us talking. I mean, again, we know each other, so that's a little bit of an unusual case. But if I was seeing somebody else that I haven't met before, there would certainly be a social relationship between us. But I'm sure that in and of itself would already qualify as a we relationship.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Next question is by Ron Mallon.
Let's see. Hi, thank you very much for that interesting talk. I had a question. So from my way of thinking about these questions, whether something like the self or is constituted by an individual or a group is going to depend pretty closely on exactly what the features are that we want to have explained. And so I was thinking about your title and of course the larger discussion that you're participating in, and the role of the subject position. So these things are pronouns, we and I, and of course you could say, is the I and the he the same, or is the I and the him the same? What about the we and the us? And so I wondered about the role of the fact that you're talking about the subject position when you talk about we or I is playing in specifying the phenomenon. It seems like in this discussion that you're participating in, where the primary thing to be concerned with is something that acts. It seems really important, possibly, that there's a subject going on, but it's not so clear if I think about us, something happening to us, that it's very important that we're the kind of thing that can act or not. And I just wondered if you could just explain how you thought about the role that the different positions of the pronoun were playing in specifying the features that were to be explained. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think probably, I mean, well, so just one initial point. I mean, I don't think I would want to commit to the view that it's just action that is important, because I think there is a room for the subject position, to use your vocabulary. I mean, also in a lot of affective states. I mean, if being hit by headache, I mean, again, how do we describe that experience? And I think, it would be wrong to say, well, there is a headache, and then subsequently we have to start wondering whose headache it is. I think it's given as mine from the moment it's kind of experienced. So I think there's this subject involving aspect of experience per se. I mean, that's the view I'm kind of defending. but I think I mean, I think especially the we and the us, I think raises some interesting issues, because without really having thought a lot about it, I think I would be sympathetic to a view that would say that talking about us really complicates matters, because it's typically in the context of the encounter with another group that something like an awareness of us starts to make sense. So to put it differently, I mean, there are people who would say, you know, group formation always requires outsiders. There has to be this contrasting it group, out group, in order for the group to be constituted as one. Now, I don't accept that, because I think one can find a lot of we experiences that doesn't really require any demarcation vis-a-vis non-members. And so just imagine, I mean, the case with two people, you know, carrying a big refrigerator up the stairs. This is something we are doing. I think that makes perfect sense to have that experience, even we're not considering others. So we could stand, you know, enjoy a sunrise. Again, that would be a different experience than me standing there alone. And again, I don't think that would require demarcating it vis-a-vis outsiders. But I think the moment outsiders come up, and the moment outsiders start recognizing us as a group, I think then, you know, there are a lot of different, or a lot of additional layers and complications are added onto it. So I think it's very interesting to precisely start considering these modulations, if you will, and I just think that will just make it. I mean, that will just call for an even more sophisticated account to be. You know, we need a more sophisticated account in order to address that kind of situations.
All right. I think time is over. So please join me in virtually thanking Dan. Thanks for your talk. Thanks for the discussion. Thanks to all the participants.
Thanks for inviting.
See you some other meeting. Bye. Bye-bye.